Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the Torah class. We're studying the Torah portion of Toldos. If you're in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, you can find it on page 124. If you're in any other Chumash, it's the sixth Torah portion in the book of Genesis. And we're now going to learn about the second of the three patriarchs, Isaac, who in last week's Torah portion married Rebecca, and now he's ready to start a family. And the opening story is about Rebecca and Isaac being barren for the first 20 years of their marriage, and finally being blessed not only with one child, but with twins. Now, incidentally, nothing to do with the class, but I read an article recently, a week ago, about this family, American family, not Jewish family, that had 14 sons, and they kept on trying for a girl. They had the 15th child, and it was a girl. So some people are blessed with a lot of children, but the patriarchs and the matriarchs always had trouble conceiving. And you start to wonder, is this by chance or by design? Sarah had trouble having Isaac till her old age. And then we see that Rebecca has trouble conceiving, difficulties and fertility. And then Leah, who is the main Rachel, who is the really the one that Jacob wanted to marry, had trouble conceiving. And our rabbis say something interesting, that God desires the prayers of the righteous, and God wanted them to turn to him in prayer. Now, what does that exactly mean? And one explanation is that if you look at Judaism and you say, what is the most important focus of all of Judaism? It's our children. Vishinantam levanecha, we say in the Shema morning and evening, teach it to your children. Talmud Torah, teaching Torah, is the most important principle in Judaism. The Haggadah, the Passover Seder, all revolves around the children. The secret to Jewish continuity has always been education, teaching our children. Now, the focus of Jewish life is children. Having children, raising children, continuity. And here, we find that in life, and this is just a fact of life, that which does not come easy to us, we appreciate. That which comes easy to us, we take for granted. If you make a living without any difficulties, you don't appreciate it as much as someone who had to really work hard to achieve that, or health, or any other matter. Because for all of our patriarchs and matriarchs, having children came with difficulty. Therefore, there was this emphasis on appreciating the gift of children and giving our children the utmost of our attention. So I saw a quote just today that said, your children grow up fast. You can't stop that. That's going to happen automatically. All you get to choose is whether you're going to be present to watch them grow up. And that's what Judaism emphasizes. Don't neglect your most valuable gift, and that is your children. Make that your priority. Don't allow other things to distract you from the focus of life, which is raising the next generation of Jewish children who will make you proud, and raise grandchildren in that vein. So by depriving our ancestors of their children, perhaps the Torah was giving us in our genetic DNA a passionate devotion to our children, because when you're blessed, Abraham and Sarah only had one child, which was, of course, Isaac. Isaac and Rebecca only had two children. So Jacob, of course, with Leah had many children, but with Rachel only had two. So there was a greater and a deeper emphasis and value placed on children, and that value and emphasis of children has remained consistent till today. But let's just take a look at the opening verse of this week's Torah portion, because it seems to be repetitious. And Rashi, amongst all the commentaries, ask why the repetition. The opening verse says, this is the offspring of Isaac, the son of Abraham. And you would think the verse would then go into the story of Isaac and Rebecca having children, which was Jacob and Esau. But right after it says, this is the offspring of Isaac, the son of Abraham, the verse says, Abraham begot Isaac. Now, why does the Torah in the opening verse, we know there's no extra words in the Torah. There aren't even extra letters in the Torah. So why would the Torah write 4 extra words? It said, these are the children of Isaac, the son of Abraham. So we already know that Abraham is the father of Isaac because we said Isaac, the son of Abraham. So why does the Torah have to then say Abraham fathered Isaac? So Rashi asked this question, and Rashi answers that in last week's Torah portion, we read about Sarah being abducted by Avimelech, one of the kings who saw her beauty and took her for a wife, but then God afflicted his household and he released her. Suddenly, after that incident, Sarah becomes pregnant and conceives a child. So Rashi says the scoffers, the mockers, those who like to poke fun, just for the sake of jest, started to spread rumors. You know who Sarah's child is from? Not from Abraham, because Abraham's such an old man. He's 100 years old. And they never had a child. Clearly, they couldn't conceive. Suddenly, after Avimelech abducts Sarah, she gets pregnant. It must be that Isaac's father is not Abraham, but Avimelech. And that's a very nasty rumor to spread. But those who like to, the gossip columnists, that's all they look to do, to spread gossip. So that's what they did. They said, Isaac is not the son of Abraham. He must be the son of Avimelech. So therefore, the verse says as follows. This is the story of the genealogy of the children of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham gave birth to Isaac. What does that mean? Rashi says that God made Isaac's face to be identical, a spitting image of his father, so that everyone testified. In other words, in order to disperse those who are making fun of Isaac, saying he wasn't born from Abraham, he was born from Avimelech, God created a transformation of the face of Isaac to become identical to Abraham, so that everyone would start testifying that clearly, just look at the resemblance between father and son. Isaac must be the son of Abraham, not the son of Avimelech. This was the miracle that God made. I'm reminded of the story of this mother who brought her child to the pediatrician after the first month visit. And the doctor says, oh, your baby's so cute. He's adorable. He's gorgeous. And the mother said, oh, come on. You told that to every mother. You're just flattering me. And the doctor says, no, I only say it to those mothers who have cute babies. So the mother says, really, what do you say to a mother who comes in for a first month visit and the baby's not cute? So the doctor says, I look at her and I say, oh, your baby looks just like you. So we all like to hear that our children look like us, right? It's usually some kind of a compliment. But in the case of Isaac, he was identical. Now, why would they not be identical, or why would they not have a resemblance? Many times children resemble their parents. And our rabbis on a deeper level explain that Kabbalistically, Abraham represented the attribute of kindness. We had a tent with the 4 doors. We know the story that he ran after the guests, invited them in, even though he was in pain from circumcision. We read that a few weeks ago. Isaac, who was ready to be bound on the altar, and as we're going to see in this week's parsha, he undigs the wells of his father. He stands up to the king of the Philistines. He represented Gevurah, which is strength, discipline, power. It's a different characteristic. It's a different personality. Now, your facial expression and features are really a reflection of your soul. The word panim in Hebrew means face, and the word panim means inward. Your outer appearance reflects your inner appearance. So a man of kindness will have a different physical appearance than a man of strength and discipline and severity. That's why naturally they look different. But God made it that they should be identical. But in order to squelch those rumors that were being spread by the mockers and the jesters who were mocking Abraham and saying he wasn't the father of Isaac. But there's another deeper explanation here, and that is that even though Abraham served God in the attribute of chesed, kindness, and Isaac, gevurah, strength and power, restraint, discipline, yet, our rabbis say, they were identical. Now, what does this mean? So, what this means to say is something very, very important for us to remember in life. Sometimes I once heard this great quote that someone said, be yourself because everyone else is taken already. Sometimes we mistakenly try to imitate others rather than realize that God wants us to be ourselves. If God wanted us to be like that person, he would have just made two of them. He made you who you are because he wants you to use your particular strengths and capabilities to your fullest. There's a famous story of the Hasidic master of Zusha on his deathbed. He was crying. The student said, "Why are you crying?" He says, "I fear not when I come before God after my life. If he says, why weren't you like Moses or Abraham or Maimonides? I'm not as great as them. I can't be expected to be like them. But if God says, Zusha, why weren't you Zusha? What am I going to answer?" All God wants you to do is be yourself. And if you're being yourself, you're as great as anyone else. Because two people externally may seem like one is greater than the next, but if both of them are living to their utmost potential, fulfilling their potential, they're identical. He's fulfilling his potential and he's fulfilling his potential. She's fulfilling her potential, she is fulfilling her potential. And therefore they're identical. I once heard a story. They once asked also a Hasidic master, maybe it was Reb Zusha, if you could switch places with Abraham, would you do that? You would be Abraham, he would be Zusha. And he said no. They said, why not? He said, because God would still only have one Abraham and one Zusha. What benefit would there be? So God made you who you are, and God made that person who they are, and you have to live to your potential. If Isaac was being the best Isaac he can be with his potential and his attributes, then he was identical to Abraham because they were both serving God to the fullest capacity. You know, each one of our patriarchs and matriarchs were trailblazers, and they each blazed their own trail, but all the trails led to the same destination, which was serving Hashem. And because of that, we can say they were all truly identical. So that is the opening story. Now, when they were barren, they prayed to God for children. So here's what the verse says. So first of all, that was the first verse. The second verse says, Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Who is Rebekah? The daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban. Now, if you were in Shul this past Shabbos, or if you were on the Torah Zoom last week, you know that the entire Torah portion that we had just a week ago was all about Eliezer going to the well, finding Rivka with the jug of water, offering water for the camels and for him to drink. And then he goes home and he meets the brother and the father of Rebekah and convinces them to let her go and marry Isaac. So why do we have to remind ourselves here? Why does the Torah have to tell us Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, who was the daughter of Bethuel and the sister of Laban? We just read that a week ago. It's not like we learned it a month ago or a year ago. It was last week's Torah portion. Why do we have to, again, the Torah doesn't write an extra word or letter. So Rashi says something beautiful, that it's saying this as a praise of Rebekah, that even though she came from a home where her father was Bethuel and her sister, her brother was Laban, she didn't learn from their ways, and she remained righteous and married Isaac, was worthy and suitable to marry Isaac. And again, a very powerful lesson. The lesson is that sometimes we define ourselves by our past and we remain stuck in our past. Rebecca teaches us that you could move beyond your circumstances. This is a conversation that we have often, that some people in therapy are still talking about what their parents did to them 30 years ago. And it's like, it's been 30 years. You're a free person. You're an adult. You can make your own choices. You can't go through your whole life saying, I'm still confined, imprisoned, restricted, held back because of my parents. It's a new generation. There's a future. You're your own person. You have free choice. And that's the lesson here. The Torah is saying, to the credit of Rebekah, to the praise of Rebekah, she was able to transcend her upbringing, her family environment, and become a righteous woman worthy to marry Isaac. Then we have the third verse. The third verse says that Isaac and Rebekah were both praying for children together. And the verse says something interesting, that Isaac entreated Hashem opposite his wife, or opposite his wife. It could sound like physically they were facing each other when they prayed. And then it says God answered him. So what's going on here? What does it mean they prayed opposite each other? And why doesn't it say God answered them? They both prayed, so God should have answered both of them. Why does it mean God answered him? And she becomes pregnant as a result of their prayers. So here we have many interpretations, but one that's Rashi's interpretation combined with other ideas is as follows. Each one had an advantage. The advantage of Isaac was that he grew up in a righteous home. His father was righteous. His mother was righteous. He had a holy, pure, good environment. The advantage of Rebecca was that she grew up in a home that was filled with idolatry, and she left that behind and changed her ways. So each one prayed opposite the other. When Rebecca prayed, Rebecca said, listen, God, not in my merit, but in the merit of my husband, Isaac, who was so righteous. He came from a righteous home. He led a pure life from day one. In his merit, grant us children. Isaac, on the other hand, said, no, God, in the merit of my wife, who came from a house of idolatry and was able to raise herself up, lift herself up from that environment and become a righteous woman, in her merit, you should do it. And God answered his prayer, meaning God was saying, yes, the merit of the woman, the wife who transcended her upbringing is even greater than your own merit, because our rabbis tell us that the level of a Baal Teshuvah is greater than a perfectly righteous person. A person who never sinned has no temptation because they don't know what the sin even looks like or feels like or tastes like. But somebody who grew up in a background where they were engaged in things that they were not supposed to, not to their own fault, just because of their circumstances, and then they chose a new path, that takes tremendous inner resolve and courage and strength to forge a new path. So therefore, the Baal Teshuvah is on a higher level than the completely righteous person, and therefore is in her merit even more than his merit. And, if I walk into Publix, I see things that are not kosher, whether I see cheeseburgers, McDonald's, I don't know, I see lobster, I see shrimp. I never, ever had any desire whatsoever to eat it. It's not a struggle. It's not a temptation. It's not something that I have to fight any urges, because I don't even know what it tastes like, nor do I want to know or care to know. But somebody who ate things that were not kosher, and then they resolved to keep kosher, that takes strength. And that's true in every area of life. So therefore, the Torah says that God answered his prayer on behalf of his wife because she was even more righteous than him, in the sense that she went beyond her past. Now, if you remember that Isaac was the one who Eliezer had to go find a marriage partner for. And next week's parsha, we're going to read about how Jacob met his wife by the well. He found her. He fell in love with her. It was almost love at first sight, you can say. Abraham and Sarah, we don't know how they met, but Isaac has a matchmaker. Now, Isaac wasn't 20 years old even. He was 37 at the time. Why is it that his father had to send a matchmaker? Why couldn't he find his own shidduch? And the explanation given is that his father wanted a girl from his hometown of Haran, not from the Canaanites. He didn't like the practices of the Canaanites where he was living in Canaan, where God had sent him to inherit the land of Israel. So he wanted someone from Haran, where he was born, his birthplace. But if that's the case, why didn't he send Isaac to go find a girl from Haran? And the answer is that Isaac is the only patriarch that never set foot out of Israel. There are certain Jews today, I've met some of them, they live in Israel, and they never left Israel their whole life, nor do they want to leave Israel. They want to live their whole lives in Israel. They want to stay within the boundaries, the borders of Israel. And they won't even go on a vacation to anywhere outside of Israel. They'll only stay in Israel. Why? Because Isaac was considered the holiest of all the patriarchs in this regard, that he never left Israel. So when it came time to marry, Eliezer had to bring a girl to marry him. Now, what is this idea that Abraham was traveling around and Jacob had to travel around? And the only patriarch that doesn't travel and stays in Israel is Isaac. Furthermore, at one point in this week's parsha, there was a hunger. And it says in chapter 26 that Isaac was about to head out of Israel to find food in the land of Egypt. And God appears to Isaac and says, don't go to Egypt. Sit here. Stay here in the land of Israel. I'll be with you. I'll bless you. Everything will work out. I'll give you this land of Israel. And sure enough, he ends up remaining there, and he's blessed, and he becomes very successful. But why does God say, don't leave? God insists he doesn't go to Egypt. He can't leave Israel. Why? And here we have two models of righteousness, the Abraham and Jacob model versus the Isaac model. And the best way to explain it is the mailman versus a magnet. Okay, a mailman goes door to door and delivers mail. There's a type of a patriarch or a spiritual religious leader who goes knocking door to door to disseminate inspiration. And that's a very good thing. We learn from Abraham to do that, that as Jews, we can't be insular. We can't just sit in the synagogue and wait for Jews to show up and say, teach me Torah, or teach me how to pray, or do mitzvahs. We have to be doing outreach. We have to go out and spread the word, spread the light, spread the knowledge, share it with others, like go door to door and try to, like a salesman. He doesn't sit at home and wait for customers to come to him. He takes his merchandise, he goes on the road and he looks for customers. As Jews, we have to be, reaching out to our fellow Jews and showing them and teaching them and engaging them. But there is a second model, and that's the model of Isaac. Later we see that Avimelech, the king of Gerar, he hears about Isaac and how successful he was. And he comes to him and he says, why did you come to me when originally you sent me away? Madu and Basamala, you hated me, he said, and you sent me away. And what does Avimelech say? He says, we've seen that God is with you, and therefore we want to make a peace treaty with you. In other words, sometimes a person becomes so righteous and so great that in a world of so much, duplicity and falsehood, when people see this person is so great, they are drawn to that person like a magnet. And they come to that person and they say, teach us, be with us, inspire us. So there's the model of the tzaddik who goes out to teach others. And then there's the model of people who are coming to them. And both of them are possible. Some people just stay in their place and people flock to them. I'll give you an example. I grew up in the Chabad with the Rabbi. And of course, the Rabbi told his students to go far and wide and go to every continent in the earth. And, Chabad now is literally on every, part of the globe spreading Yiddishkeit. So the Rabbi believed in going out, spreading the message, not being an insular community. And there are thousands and thousands of Chabad centers worldwide. At the same time, you may know that the Rebbe never went anywhere. He never even went to Israel. Before I talked about people who never left Israel, the Rebbe never left Brooklyn, basically. One or two, he would go to Queens to his father-in-law's cemetery grave to pray very frequently. And he once went to upstate New York to visit the camp up there once. Besides those two exceptions, for all of his 42 years of leadership, he never set foot out of Brooklyn, never left Crown Heights, never left his office. But the whole world came to Crown Heights, came to his door for advice, for guidance, for blessings, for inspiration. So you could have that tzaddik who everyone comes to him because he's so great. But for most people, they're not on that level that everyone's going to flock to them because they heard of their righteousness and their saintliness and their wisdom and their inspiration. So therefore, people will travel, must go out and spread Yiddishkeit all over the world. And there have been many models of both examples. The Baal Shem Tov was known to travel all around, but there were many tzaddikim who didn't, and people came to them. So that's the idea of Isaac remaining insular. Now, the main event of this week's Parsha is the story of the blessings of Jacob. But before we get that, there's a story that sets the stage for the main event in this week's Parsha. It's like the backstory that lets us understand the other story in context. And that is the story of Esav, who is the firstborn. Now, they were twin brothers, but Esav came out first. And Jacob was holding on to the heel of his brother because he wanted to be the firstborn. And that's why he's called Yaakov. Yaakov means heel. Akev is a heel because he was grasping the heel of his brother. And he always wanted to be the firstborn. Now, why do you want to be the firstborn? Because the firstborn has special responsibilities and privileges and spiritual rights. Birthright, as they call it. The first birthright, the Bechor. But his brother Esav beat him. But Jacob and Esav took two divergent paths in life. Jacob was a man who, the verse says, he sat in the tent, he was studying, he was meditating, he was a spiritual person. And then the other brother, Esav, was a materialistic brother. I don't know, maybe you know siblings. Don't tell me who they are. Maybe in your own family. We have two siblings. They grew up in the same home, and one is very materialistic. All they want is material things. They're consumed with materialism. And the other one is spiritual. You say, how could they be brother and sister or brother and brother, especially twins? Esav was a hunter. He was a man of the field. He liked to go out there and engaged in wildlife, including, our rabbis say, banditry, thievery, stealing. He was just consumed with physical passions and desires. Jacob was a lofty spiritual man. He had no interest in the worldly matters. All he wanted to do was learn from his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham how to be a righteous Jew and perpetuate the family spiritual legacy, bring the heirs to the dynasty of the Jewish nation. And Jacob sees what his brother's up to. And it was the day that Abraham died, and Esav didn't even show up to the funeral of his grandfather because his grandfather was some old Jewish rabbi, he was not interested. But then he shows up in the evening after a day of hunting in the field, and he sees the way the mourners are there, and Jacob is in the kitchen preparing soup, lentil soup. Why lentil soup? Because mourners eat round foods to symbolize the fact that the world is round, life and death, and also there's no mouth to round foods, that the mourner is like speechless. He's in a state of shock and grief. And he sees his brother preparing the soup, and he walks into the kitchen. It doesn't say the kitchen, but he walks into the house. And he says to Jacob, his brother, pour down some of that red hot soup into my throat because I am exhausted. Now, he doesn't say he's hungry. He says he's tired because, sometimes you eat because you're hungry. Sometimes you eat because you're emotionally tired, meaning emotional eating. He wasn't eating because he was hungry. He was eating because he was drained from his immoral practices, which creates this inner dissonance that makes you unhappy and discontent. But putting that aside, he says, pour me down some of that hot soup, which is the way an animal eats. He says, he doesn't say pour me a bowl of soup. He says, pour it down my throat. And Jacob says, this is my opportunity. He says to his brother, listen, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal. I'll give you a bowl of soup if you sell me your birthright. And what does Esav say? Esav says, I'm going to die anyways. What do I need this birthright? Deal. You could have the birthright, just give me the soup. And Jacob gives Esav the soup with some bread, gives him a nice meal, and he acquires the birthright. This is the preparation for the next main event that's going to happen in this week's parsha. But before we get to that, we have to look at what happened here. And the way, you could look at this story as Esav later looks on it, and he says, my brother deceived me. He took advantage of my hunger. He got me to give up my birthright for a bowl of beans, as they say. But Jacob recognized that Esav had no appreciation for the responsibilities and the privileges of birthright, and therefore it didn't belong in his hands. And therefore he took the opportunity to acquire it so that the birthright could be treated and exercised in a proper fashion and not misused and mishandled by someone who has no appreciation. And the proof is that he says, I'm going to die anyways. What do I need it for? You could have it. I don't want the honor and the privilege of being a firstborn, which carries certain responsibilities. And when you listen to Esav's words, it's almost like the words you hear today from people who live a hedonistic lifestyle. And they say, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you may die. Now, some people say, if tomorrow you may die, the great sage Rabbi Eliezer said, repent one day before you die. And a student said, how do you know the day you're going to die? To repent one day before you die. He said, that's the point. Every day you should be repenting and doing the best you can, because today may be your last day. So live the best version of life that you can live today. But other people take that conclusion and draw a different lesson. They say, since tomorrow I may die, then I got to party today. I got to eat, drink, and be merry. Esav's philosophy is eat, drink, and be merry. He says, I'm going to die anyways. What do I need this birthright for? Sometimes you're on a plane and there's turbulence. It's getting scary. So as a religious Jew, he takes out his book of Psalms. He starts praying to God. And the guy next to him tells the stewards, get me a scotch on the rocks. I want to drink. How do you respond to life's turbulence? So going back to Esav, he says, what do I need this birthright for? I'm going to die anyways. And then the last words of the verse is Vayives Esav Esav Chora. Esav spurned, he disgraced the birthright. By selling it for a bowl of soup, it showed him how little value it had for him. Now, why is this the prelude to the main event of the Torah portion? Because the next story, which is really the heart and soul of this week's Parsha, is the blessings of Isaac. And everyone knows this story. Isaac is on his deathbed. He says, I'm getting old, he says to his son Isaac. Isaac says to Esav, and I don't know the day I'm going to die. And rabbis say that he was within the 5-year range of when his mother died. He was 123. His mother, Sarah, died at 127. Rabbis say when you're within 5 years of the age of your parents, you start getting concerned about your lifespan. So he says to his son, Esav, you're my firstborn. I want to give you the birthright, blessing. So why don't you go out into the field, hunt an animal for me, prepare it, and bring it to me. I'll eat dinner, and after dinner, I'm going to give you this blessing. And the rest of the story is, of course, that Esav goes out in the field to go hunt an animal. Rebecca, the wife of Isaac, overhears her husband telling her older son, Esav, go prepare a meal for me, go hunt an animal, prepare a meal, and come back and I'll give you the blessing. And she doesn't want the blessing to go to her son Esav because she knows Esav is not worthy, he's not righteous. She wants Jacob to receive it. So what does she do? The major event of this week's Parsha, she runs to Jacob and says, I mean, this is an unbelievable story with 1,000,001 questions that will only be able to scratch the surface with a few of the questions. But this is a huge story, which, like I said, kicks up a lot of questions. But this is what she does. She tells her son, go quickly and get goat skin and put it on your hands and you disguise yourself as Esav, because Esav was very hairy. And go to your father, I'll prepare the meal. Go bring me a kid from the stock. Go to the cattle, take a sheep, and I'll prepare a nice meal. And you'll bring it, and you'll bring the meal to your father, and you will disguise yourself as your brother Esav. You'll pretend to be your brother Esav, and you will take the blessings. And sure enough, at first, Jacob's a little hesitant. He's reticent to do this. He says, well, what's if my father discovers my ruse and that I'm not really Esav? He'll curse me. And the mother says, the curse will be on me. You do as I tell you to do. Jacob goes. He disguises himself by putting on the hairy skin of the goat. And she prepares the meal from the sheep, from the cattle. And he goes into his father, and we don't have time to go into all the details, but there's a lot of details here. But basically, he says, please, Dad, sit up. I want to serve you. His father was elderly and blind at that point. And Jacob brings the meal to his father, Isaac. And Isaac is very suspicious. And he says, how did you get back so quickly? You know, like he knows to go hunt an animal and prepare. It takes more time. And Jacob talks the way Jacob talks. He says, oh, God, help me find an animal quickly today. And now Isaac is more suspicious. He knows his son Esav doesn't talk that way. God, help me find an animal, like, you know. So he says, come here, let me feel your skin. I want to confirm that you're really Esav because I have my doubts. And he comes forward, he feels his hand, and it's hairy like Esav's. And then he says the famous words, the voice is the voice of Jacob, meaning the way he talks, the voice, and also the language he uses is the voice of Jacob. He speaks politely, respectfully, but the hands are the hands of Esav. But he goes out and he blesses him after he eats. He leaves his father's presence, and moments later, Esav arrives and says, okay, Dad, sit up. I got your food. I want you to eat and give me the blessings. And this is where Isaac says, what? You were just here. I just gave you the blessings. At that point, Esav realizes and Isaac realizes what has happened. And Isaac basically says, your brother came and took your blessings. And Esav gives out a wailing cry, a bitter cry. And he says, do you only have one blessing, Father? Don't you have a blessing for me too? And at that point, Isaac does give Esav a secondary blessing, but he said the primary blessing I've already given to your brother Jacob. And at this point, you see the frustration and the anger and the bitterness of Esav, where he says, this is the second time my brother deceived me. He deceived me with the birthright, and now he deceived me with the blessing. He tricked me out of my birthright, and now he tricked me out of the blessing. Now, legally, Jacob was entitled to the blessing because he had purchased the birthright. But this raises a lot of questions. And the big moral questions, or questions that arise here, is, first of all, what basis did Jacob have to deceive his elderly father, take advantage of his blindness and his being old and senile, or being handicapped and not being able to see? Isn't this lack of integrity, of honesty, of decency? It's your own father nonetheless, and you're perpetrating a fraud on your father. That in itself is a very difficult question. But what makes the question more complex is that who was behind this whole thing? His mother. So the mother is telling the son to go trick the father. What's happening between Isaac and Rebekah? Why doesn't Rebekah communicate with her husband? Why does she work against her husband through the son? Now, these are so many questions that would take a long time to unpack all of this. But let's build some basic understanding here. What's going on here? The verse told us earlier on that you have two parents and two children, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Esau. And the Torah told us very clearly that Rebekah loved Jacob and Isaac loved Esau. So each one had, if you just read the verse, each one had their favorite child. Now we could understand why Rebekah would love Jacob. He was the child that was following the proper path, giving them nachas, so to speak. But why would Isaac favor Esau? And here, again, there's many different discussions, many commentaries. But the basic, perhaps, understanding is that this is a dilemma that, unfortunately, when we read about the patriarchs and the matriarchs, we're reading about real people with real challenges. In Judaism, we don't have saints. We have human beings who have challenges in their life. And the Torah records the challenges because the Torah wants us to understand that this is part of life. We all have struggles. We all have family issues sometimes. And one of the scenarios, or one of the dilemmas, is what do you do with a child who's rebellious, a child who's defiant or not following in the proper path? So there's two attitudes. One attitude, and by the way, we saw this with Abraham and Yishmael. Sarah, the mother, said, drive Yishmael out of the house. I don't want this kid around. Now, it wasn't her child. It was Hagar's child. But Abraham was torn. He didn't know what to do because he loved Ishmael. It was his son. And God had to tell Abraham, listen to your wife, Sarah, and do what she tells you to do. And that's when Abraham sent away Ishmael and his mother. But here it's their own child. But Rebekah says, look, I can't control this Esav. He's doing his own thing. He's not following in our ways. And therefore, I want to make sure my son Jacob receives the blessing because he's going to be the perpetuation of the Jewish family. But instead of understanding Isaac as just being a blind man who was deceived by his child, because our rabbis say there was game in his mouth, literally means he fed his father. He was a good son. Our rabbis say no one did the mitzvah of honoring your father like Esau did. I hate to use this analogy, but you ever heard of these mafiosa guys, mobsters who go out and kill people and do all sorts of terrible things, but they're good to their mother. They make sure their mother's well taken care of. Esau has this image in the oral tradition of the rabbis of being this type of mobster guy, doing all sorts of bad things during the day, but he always took care of his father. He made sure his father had what he needed. So literally the verse says there was game in his mouth, meaning he went out and hunted and provided for his father. But our rabbis give us another interpretation that he tricked him, he deceived him. He would ask him religious questions, to show his father that he was righteous. So a literal reading is that he tricked his father into thinking he's a good son. And maybe Rebekah didn't want to tell Isaac the truth. They didn't want to break his heart. You can see the dynamics here. Rebekah sees things clearly, that Esau is a good for nothing. But Esau is tricking his father. And our rabbis even tell us the questions he would ask. How do you give tithe from salt? Salt, you don't have to give tithe, but he wanted to give tithes, charity from salt. He was acting super righteous. Now, what is Rebecca supposed to do? Go to her husband and break his heart and tell him, by the way, you're blind. You don't see what he's doing all day. Literally blind, figuratively blind. He's her elderly husband. She didn't want to cause him that aggravation. But at the same time, she had to make sure that the right son gets the blessing. So she works with Jacob to get the blessing for Yaakov. So, and another approach perhaps is that Isaac knew that his son Esau wasn't a good son, but he hoped that with love he could bring him back. And when he saw these questions coming forward, he didn't see it as hypocrisy. He saw it as the good part of Esau, that there's a good, holy part within Esau that wants to be righteous. And he hoped he could redeem that part in him and draw it out and develop it and salvage and save his son, that he doesn't completely veer off the path and get lost from the Jewish family, which he ultimately did. He's not part of the Jewish family. And a matter of fact, our rabbis tell us that one of the great converts was Rabbi, who was a descendant of Esau. So he saw the potential that was within Esau, that, when you look at a person and you judge the person, only God sees the big picture. Now, Isaac was able to see the future descendants, but sometimes not such good people, or even bad people, have great descendants. And sometimes great people don't have good descendants. So you can't just judge one generation. So Isaac is looking multi-generational, thinking, okay, there's a great rabbi coming out of him down the road. Maybe I could salvage my son too. But Rebecca's more pragmatic, and she wants to make sure the blessing goes into the right hands. But there's a third approach to this, and that is that if you look at the blessing that Isaac gives to Jacob, thinking that it's Esau, it's really a physical blessing. May God give you from the dew of the heaven. Yiten lecha Elokim, and God give you the dew of the heavens and the fat of the earth and the abundant grain and wine. It's a physical blessing. Later, before he heads out, when he has to flee the home because Esau vows to take revenge and kill his brother, he goes back to his father a second time, and he gets the second blessing from his father. And this time he says to him the following. He says to him, may God bless you, that you should become prosperous, fruitful, and numerous, and may you become a congregation of peoples. May he grant you the blessing of Abraham to you and your offspring with you, that you may possess the land of your sojourns which God gave to Abraham. So when he thought he was blessing Esau, he gives a physical, material blessing. When he later sends him off to get married, he says, may you carry on the legacy of Abraham, because now he knows it's his son, Jacob, which tells us that maybe all along, he never wanted to give the spiritual blessings to Esau. He wanted to give him the fat of the land and the earth, the dew of the heaven and the fatness of the earth. And he said, let me give the material blessings to my son Esau, because he's a materialistic boy. And to my son Jacob, I'll give the spiritual blessings to have a congregation of families, a nation, a great nation, and possess the land of Israel and the legacy of Abraham. But Rebecca didn't agree to that. Why didn't she agree to that? Because Isaac thought, look, I'll make one person materialistically blessed, the other one spiritually blessed, and they'll work together. He'll provide for his material needs. He'll be a spiritual influence for him, and they'll work together as brothers. But Rebecca realized there was no brotherly love there, and that wasn't going to happen. And she wanted to make sure that her son, Jacob, not only got the spiritual blessings, but was also physically provided for and not dependent on his brother Esau for his material prosperity. There's a story, Al Gore told a story once that he was at a dinner in Washington with former Senator Bill Bradley, who was a former NBA basketball star. And he said a waiter came by and served the main course, which was some kind of chicken, meat, and potatoes and rice or whatever. And then there was a little bit of a swirl of butter on the plate for the baked potato. And Al Gore says that Bill Bradley turned to the waiter and said, can I get another pat of butter with my potato? And the waiter said, no, sir, one per person. And Al Gore says Bill Bradley was like shocked. He looked at the waiter and said, excuse me, sir, but do you know who I am? I'm Senator Bill Bradley. I'm on the foreign, foreign affairs committee and this committee and that committee. And I'm a former NBA basketball player. and I'm asking for another pat of butter with my potato. And he said, the waiter looked at Bill Bradley and said, sir, do you know who I am? And he said, no, who are you? He said, I'm the person in charge of the butter. So sometimes someone else is in charge of the butter and you're left without butter. So Rebecca says, I need to make sure that Jacob gets not only the spiritual, but the physical blessings. Now, the deeper understanding of this is that Judaism is a different religion than most other religions. Most other religions want their adherents to be spiritual. The more spiritual, the better. If you're a monk in a monastery, you're the holiest. If you're a guru on a mountaintop, a monk or a Buddha, whatever, and you're meditating God's greatness all day, the more cut off and isolated you are from the physical world, the better off you are. And that's why priests don't get married, and the Dalai Lama doesn't get married, because they don't want to engage in physical worldly matters, have a family, then have to buy diapers, have to diaper the kids, have to do all these things, go shopping for what they need for school. I just want to pray and be holy from morning to night. And the less engaged I am in the world, the holier and the more spiritual I am. Judaism has a very different idea of spirituality. The rabbi is supposed to have the most children because it's a mitzvah, pru, be fruitful and multiply. Because to us, spirituality is not being disconnected from the world. It's not being a hermit. It's not being in isolation. Judaism says that the goal of life is to marry heaven and earth, to marry physical and spiritual, to elevate the physical and imbue the physical with spirituality. So Judaism doesn't say you should become a recluse and live in isolation apart from the world. The world is not bad. The world is not evil. You don't have to run away from the world. If you succumb to the temptations of the world and you give up your moral high ground and you just indulge in materialistic things, then the world, of course, could draw you down. But if you go into the world and you practice loving kindness and righteousness and morality and ethics and business and interactions, then you utilize the world in a beautiful way. Then you elevate the world. Then you imbue the world with the light of the Torah and goodness. And that's the goal of Judaism. So Judaism says, yes, material success and blessing is important because through that, you could have a better impact on the world. You could elevate the whole world. So therefore, Rebecca wants Jacob to have not just the spiritual blessings, but the physical blessings, because there has to be the integration of both the physical and the spiritual. In Judaism, that's the goal in life. God has angels in spiritual worlds. He wants the physical world to reflect his godliness and his divine presence. And therefore, a Jew has to engage in the world and go into the world and business and family and all the material things, but live it and do it like a Jew. Recognition of Hashem, gratitude to Hashem, kindness, all the mitzvot that we do within the physical world around us. So that's why she insists, Rebecca, that Jacob get not only the spiritual blessings, but the physical blessings as well. And the way the story ends basically is when Esav realizes that Jacob took his blessings, he vows revenge. And here's what he says. He says, Yikrevu Yemei Evel Avi. He says, I'm going to wait till my father dies, and then I'm going to take revenge against my brother. I'll kill him. He actually says, Vaharget Achi, I'm going to kill my brother. But out of respect for my father, I won't do it while he's alive. I'll wait for him to die, and then I'll take revenge. And that's when Rebecca calls Jacob and says, you got to get out of town. You got to run. Your brother's out to kill you. And he sends him off to her brother's house, Laban. And he heads out, and next week we'll follow Jacob on his journey, where he goes to the house of his uncle Laban, and he's a fugitive running from his own brother, wants to kill him, and that's where he ends up marrying his wives and having his family and so on and so forth. But here you see the way Esav's anger, and this is the danger of anger, is so great that even though he loved his father and he was so good to his father and he respected his father, now he's waiting for his father to die. As soon as dad dies, I'm going to go take revenge. Even though he loved his father and he was such a good son to his father, his anger caused him to now want his father to die so he could then go and seek revenge against his brother. And the end of the portion is, of course, Jacob running away from his brother Esav to find shelter in the house of his uncle in Haran, back in Haran, where his mother had come from, Rebecca, when she was drawing water from the well and gave water for the camels of Eliezer as well as for Eliezer, and that's the way she was discovered. And now he's running back to her family to find safe haven and protection from the wrath of his brother Esav, who wants to kill him. There's one other major event in this week's parsha that we have to talk about, and that is what Isaac is engaged in his lifetime. We talk about Isaac's children, the deception, all of that. But there's a major event about digging wells in this week's parsha. Basically, Abraham, the father of Isaac, had dug wells. The Philistines came in the land of Israel, and they closed up the wells. Now, why would they do that? It's like cutting your nose to spite your face. The wells are good. They're a source of water. And the answer is they wanted to erase any vestige and memory and history of Abraham's presence in the land so that they could conquer the land, the Philistines, not the Palestinians that we know today, the original Philistines, not connected to today's Palestinians. They just named themselves after them. And Isaac is determined to undig those wells that the Philistines closed. And time and again, he quarrels with the Philistines as he undigs the wells of his father and renames them with exact names that his father had named them, trying to replant his father's presence and memory and identity in the land of Israel and not allow the Philistines to erase his memory and close up the wells. And they quarrel over 3 different wells, and finally they make peace. That's the end of the story. They name it Be'er Sheva, the 7th well. There's still a city in Israel today called Be'er Sheva. It means the 7th well, because Abraham dug 3, the Philistines closed them up, and Isaac redug them. And finally, in the 7th well, they made peace. But this whole discussion of wells, we know that a lot of marriages were made around wells because that's a practical thing. People would meet at the well. There's also spiritual significance between marriage and a well. But here we see the main, and there are not that many stories about Isaac in the Torah, unlike Abraham and Jacob, which there are many more stories. One of the major focuses of Isaac's life is digging up the wells of his father, redigging the wells, and renaming them with the same names of his father. And the Torah spends a lot of time talking about these wells. What's the idea behind it? And again, there's a lot of commentary. But one idea that's very practical for all of us, and that is, I remember hearing a story once, this kid who applied to university. And they asked you, I guess, what's your greatest trait? And the kid said, I'm a good follower. I'm a good follower. And they wrote back to him that he's accepted. They said, because every other application says, I'm a leader. We have so many leaders here. We don't need more leaders. We need some followers. So we're going to accept you in the university. What is the idea behind this? The idea behind this is that everyone talks about leadership. Everyone wants to be a leader. Abraham was a leader. He was a pioneer. He started a new religion, Judaism. He was chosen by God. That is symbolized with the idea of digging wells. You dig a well, it means you're opening up a new reservoir, a new resource, a new source of inspiration, of water, living waters. And that's what Abraham did. He taught about monotheism and loving kindness. So what is Isaac? Isaac comes along and he has the hardest job. Why is it the hardest job? Because he is the follower of Abraham. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, one of the greatest rabbis, just passed away a week and a half ago. And his daughter, Gila, gave a eulogy that you could see it on the internet. It got already like 100,000 views. But one of the things she talks about is that her father gave their children the space to be themselves. Because sometimes when you're the child of a great man, you feel like you're not measuring up to your father's greatness. And she said, our father made us feel loved and accepted for who we were. So the point is that Abraham is the pioneer. Isaac has to continue what his father did. He redug the wells of his father and renamed them with the names that his father had named him. In other words, Isaac says, my job is to continue the legacy and the path of my father. I don't have to innovate. I don't have to create something new. Everyone wants to be an inventor, a creator, start a new ideology, a new movement, a new idea, and there's a lot of excitement in that. if you take the day, there's morning, afternoon, and evening. It says Abraham instituted the morning prayer, Yitzchak the afternoon prayer, and Jacob the evening prayer. Now, mornings are very exciting. You're fresh, you're alert, you're awake. It's a new day. It's exciting. The end of the day, it's the end of the day. You're relaxing. It's the middle of the day, sometimes the most challenging day, getting through the day. And that's why it says the holiest prayer is the afternoon prayer, because it's easy to go to synagogue in the morning. You haven't gone to work yet. It's easy in the evening. You came home from work. The middle of the day to stop and pray is the most challenging time to pray. So, and the same thing is true in marriage, right? When people fall in love, they're so excited. It's romantic, right? But what about the day-to-day? 5, 10, 15 years, a Tuesday afternoon, a Wednesday, just ordinary days, the continuity. Take learning. It's always exciting to learn something new. You haven't learned it before, but to review something you've learned already isn't as exciting. I already learned that. It's just reviewing someone else's, that what I've already learned. And endings are exciting too, because an ending is like crossing the finish line. Everyone likes to cross the finish line, but it's staying the course in the middle that sometimes is the most challenging. And that's the idea of Isaac redigging the wells. I remember hearing a story once of this man who came to a community. He was a rabbi, and he built this flourishing community. He was very creative and innovative, and he designed all these new activities and programs and ideas. And then he passed away, and his son took over as the rabbi, and he started to change everything his father did. And someone came to him and said, your father set all these programs, all these things in place. How is it that as his son, you're undoing or revamping everything he did? Isn't that disrespect to your father? And he said, no, this is the greatest respect to my father. I'm doing exactly what my father did. My father came to a town, and he was very creative. He initiated all these new ideas and programs and activities and designed, beautiful things and created a beautiful new community. I'm doing what my father did. I'm being creative. I'm being a new initiator of new ideas. But the idea is that for Judaism to succeed, you need both. You need newness, freshness. It says every day, when you learn Torah, you should learn it like it's something new, because there's a certain excitement in newness and freshness. Everyone likes to be a part of something new, a new endeavor, a new project. But at the same time, there has to be continuity. And I think this is something we could all relate to in the Jewish world today, that there's the balance between tradition. We have to stay true to who we are, our traditions, our values, our beliefs, Jewish law, Jewish practice. We can't uproot these things, God forbid. But at the same time, the world is changing, and we have to find modern ways to implement or to, attract Jews to what is traditional. So we have to change some of the methods. Like, we're on a Zoom call teaching Torah now. We couldn't do that, till recently. We have to utilize all the new innovation and opportunities out there to teach and to engage in Jewish life. But at the same time, we have to remember to remain true to what our past, and that connection to the past, but bringing it into the present and into the future, is this balance between Abraham, Isaac, and then ultimately Jacob. And the idea of redigging the wells is continuing, to carry on what our ancestors began. And if you go back to Abraham, God said, the reason I chose Abraham is because he will instruct his children to follow after him. There are many people who were great people in history, but they had no continuity. There was no continuation. If you can't take King David and Saul, right? King Saul was the first king of Israel. He was a great king. He had a different personality than King David. But the Davidic dynasty is through David, because David has continuity. Take Moses and Aaron. Moses was the greatest leader, but his children didn't necessarily carry on in his vein. Aaron, the house of Aaron, is the priest from generation to generation. In Jewish life, it's so important that we're not just good Jews on our own, which is very important, but also make sure we pass it on to our children and grandchildren. And someone once said that biologically you're Jewish if your parents and grandparents were Jewish. Spiritually, you're Jewish if your children and grandchildren are Jewish. So when we look at Jewish life, we take a big view of it. We take the success is not just one generation. It's the continuity. It's not enough to be an Abraham and start and dig new wells, but you have to make sure there's the continuity of Isaac, who continues to draw out the water from the wells. And we always have to have an eye to the future to make sure that we're perpetuating and carrying on ourselves, but also making sure that we're inspiring the next generation to carry in our vein, in our direction, and not seek to we all want to we live in a modern world, and it's all about new. You go into the supermarket, new and improved. We love the word new and improved on packages. If it's new, we assume it's better because it's new. It must be better. It's more advanced. It's more progressive. But new isn't necessarily improved. That's a fallacy to think that. There are a lot of things that are new that are not good. So yes, newness brings excitement, and we always have to have newness. And that's why when we learn Torah, we're never just reviewing the past. There's always a new insight, new ideas. We learned Torah for the past hour. Hopefully you heard things that you haven't heard before. It's the same Torah portion every week, but there's thousands of years of commentaries because there's always new insights to be drawn from it. So there always has to be newness, but also there has to be loyalty and commitment to the past. And we have to be like Abraham, to be pioneers and forge new ideas and new paths, but all while being faithful to the past, like Isaac being the continuity of his father's legacy and teachings and carrying that forward. So it's a very important Torah portion. Every Torah portion is very important, but there's a lot of very important fundamental stories here, and a lot of questions, a lot of discussion. And the Torah gives us all these stories because the Torah wants us to understand that these dynamics that happen in families have been happening for thousands of years. But despite it all, they overcame these challenges: sibling rivalry, deception, issues, parents and children, husband and wife, all the different questions that come up in this week's Torah portion, and the broad array of commentaries. But if we, stay true to ourselves and to Hashem's instructions, we forge ahead and we overcome these challenges and we persevere. And through persistence, we emerge as the Jewish people have emerged after continuously for thousands of years, passing on our traditions until this present day. So wishing everyone a beautiful day and a Shavua Tov for the rest of the week. And we look forward to seeing everyone soon in Shul, and wishing you all the best. Thank you. If you have any questions, you could type them in. We could try to address any questions before we go. Let me see if there's any questions. Throughout the Bible, the main protagonist in the Bible is the younger child: David, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. The Torah is based on meritocracy. So just because you're the older child doesn't mean, and that's what happens here. The younger child is more deserving, and therefore Rebecca wants the younger child to get the blessings. However, Isaac, as a father, loves both his children and is not ready to write off his son Esau. He's still hoping he could save him, he could salvage him, he could redeem him through his love and devotion. And building on the one mitzvah that he had, which was honoring his father, he knew he had a very special bond. And I'll just throw out one more idea before we close, and that is that, we see later Rebecca says to Jacob, go to the pen and get a sheep, and I'll prepare it. So there were animals in the stock. Why did Isaac send Esau out into the field to hunt an animal if there were animals that were available in the stock in the pen? And furthermore, you could imagine Isaac, as the patriarch, didn't believe in hunting, which is not a very Jewish sport. So why would he send his son out to hunt an animal? Now, one is because he knew he loved the mitzvah of honoring his father and mother, so he wanted to engage him in that mitzvah. But also he knew his son loved hunting. So, when you love your children and you want to bond with them, you can't always bond on your terms. You can't tell your children, do what I enjoy doing if you want to bond with me. No, you have to take what interests your child. If your child loves baseball, then you got to go play baseball with him, or whatever they enjoy, even if that's not what you enjoy. There was a story 2 years ago. There's a rabbi in England. I'm trying to remember his name. He's from Israel, Rabbi Leff. And he was visiting his children in England. And they went to a big soccer match. And the camera was, panning the tens of thousands of fans before COVID. And they focused on this rabbi in the audience with a white beard and a black hat, and he had a big volume of Talmud, and he was sitting at the sports game learning. And the commentator is like, listen, look at that guy there. He's reading a book, a big book. What's going on? And then the story came out that he was visiting his children and grandchildren in England. And there was a soccer match going on, and the kids were going. And they said, Grandpa, Zadie, you want to come with us? And the grandpa is a big rabbi. He has no interest in soccer games. He wants to study Torah. But he said, my grandchildren invited me to come. How could I not go with my grandchildren to a soccer match? So I took my volume of Talmud. I went to the soccer match, but instead of watching it, I was studying during the game. But he went. Why? Because he wanted to be with his grandchildren. That's what my grandchildren enjoy doing. I'll do it with them. So Isaac says, my son enjoys hunting. Okay, go hunt me a meal. Go get me some dinner. He engaged his son to bond with him on that level. And that's what's required sometimes. And that's what engendered that love and that connection between Isaac and Esav. And Esav, as the Talmud says, nobody performed the mitzvah as much and as well as Esav did for his father. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you for joining. All the best.